Here's what I learned after my daughter died and her husband sold her jewelry collection for $2 million. The difference between being outsmarted and being outplanned. He thought he was dealing with a grieving old man who couldn't see past his own tears. But grief doesn't make you stupid. It makes you focused. And I'd been focused on protecting my family's assets long before he ever entered the picture. Before I continue, let me know where you are listening from in the comments below. The warning signs had been there for months. Most people miss them because they want to believe family means something. But when you've spent decades in corporate security, you learn that intentions reveal themselves through patterns, not words. And his patterns had been building toward this moment long before my daughter took her final breath. The first red flag came 3 months before my daughter died, when I caught him photographing her jewelry collection during a family dinner. Most people would dismiss this as innocent curiosity, maybe even thoughtful preparation for insurance purposes. But I'd spent 40 years in corporate security. You learn to read intentions the way other people read newspapers. He claimed he was documenting for insurance purposes when I asked. Reasonable explanation on the surface. But insurance companies don't need close-ups of serial numbers on vintage Cartier pieces. They don't require detailed shots of clasp mechanisms or the interior markings of jewelry boxes. His photography session was methodical, comprehensive, and completely unnecessary for any legitimate insurance documentation. The way he handled each piece told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't admiring craftsmanship or appreciating family history. He was cataloging inventory, the weight, the materials, the condition. His fingers traced setting details and stone clarity with the précision of someone calculating resale value, not someone appreciating beauty. Over the months leading up to that dinner, his behavior around valuable items had developed this same pattern. The way he lingered near the safe when my daughter retrieved documents. The pointed questions about recent appraisals, always framed as helpful concern about proper insurance coverage. The casual mentions of how practical it would be to liquidate certain assets during difficult financial times, especially with my daughter's mounting medical bills. I watched him study room layouts during visits, noting locations of valuable items with the systematic attention of someone creating a mental inventory. He'd comment on pieces he hadn't seen before, asking about their origins and current market value. Never about their sentimental significance or family stories, always about practical considerations and monetary worth. His interest in market prices versus sentimental value became impossible to ignore. He'd research auction results for similar pieces, bringing up recent sales of comparable jewelry as dinner conversation. He knew the current value of gold, platinum, and precious stones. He could estimate resale potential with uncomfortable accuracy. The most telling moment came when he suggested my daughter update her will to simplify things for everyone involved. His reasoning seemed sound at first. Streamline the process, reduce legal complications, make transitions easier for the family during an already difficult time. But when someone suggests eliminating family oversight from an inheritance process, they're revealing their intention to bypass the necessary checks and balances that protect assets from exactly the kind of predatory behavior they're planning to exhibit. His questions during family gatherings revealed the comprehensive nature of his intelligence gathering. He'd ask about insurance policies, storage locations, security systems. Never directly, always wrapped in seemingly innocent conversation about family financial planning or estate management. But the information he sought was strategic and thorough. The way he photographed the collection that night confirmed my suspicions. He documented everything with the thoroughness of a professional appraiser. Serial numbers, hallmarks, condition details, even the interior mechanisms of jewelry boxes that would help identify pieces later. This wasn't casual documentation. This was systematic cataloging for someone who was building a database of profitable targets. I realized I was watching someone case my daughter's assets with the methodical approach of a career criminal. The photography session was reconnaissance. The casual questions were intelligence gathering. The suggestions about estate planning were attempts to remove protective barriers. Financial predators operate on long timelines, assessing opportunities months or years before they strike. They study security measures, catalog valuable assets, and identify the most vulnerable moments to execute their plans. They test family dynamics to understand who might provide oversight and who might be eliminated from decision-making processes. The difference between genuine concern and predatory assessment lies in the details. Someone genuinely worried about insurance coverage asks general questions about policy adequacy. Someone planning theft wants specific information about individual item values, storage locations, and security protocols. That night, after he left with his comprehensive photographic record of my daughter's jewelry collection, I made the decision that would ultimately save our family legacy. I started planning this. A swap that would turn his greed against him and provide the evidence needed to put him away permanently. The challenge was timing. My daughter was getting sicker, and I knew his window of opportunity was approaching rapidly. But I also knew that the methodical way he'd assessed the collection meant he believed he understood exactly what he'd be stealing. His confidence in his intelligence gathering would become his greatest vulnerability. I began documenting his behavior with the same systematic approach he'd used to catalog the jewelry. Every suspicious question, every lingering glance at valuable items, every suggestion about estate planning that seemed designed to reduce family oversight. I was building a case file on someone who thought he was building a theft plan. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. He was so focused on cataloging what he planned to steal that he never considered the possibility that someone might be cataloging his predatory behavior. His arrogance made him careless, and his carelessness would eventually provide all the evidence needed to convict him. 6 months of careful observation taught me that the difference between paranoia and preparation often comes down to documentation. Paranoid people see threats everywhere without evidence. Prepared people collect evidence of actual threats and develop systematic responses to neutralize them. His systematic assessment of the jewelry collection was the final piece of evidence I needed to confirm what I'd suspected for months. He wasn't preparing to inherit family heirlooms. He was preparing to liquidate assets that didn't belong to him, and he was planning to do it quickly and quietly after my daughter died. The trap was already forming in my mind as I watched him leave that night, confident in his reconnaissance mission and completely unaware that he'd just provided me with all the justification. I needed to destroy him. But first, I needed to give him something worth stealing. Creating a convincing replica of a $2 million jewelry collection requires more than just buying cheap knockoffs at the mall. The real challenge was matching not just the appearance, but the weight, the feel, even the way light reflected off each piece when held under different lighting conditions. One mistake would destroy everything. A clasp that felt too light in someone's fingers. A stone that caught light differently than the original. A setting that looked authentic from 3 feet away but revealed its synthetic nature under closer inspection. The entire deception would collapse if he noticed any inconsistency during what I knew would be a hurried collection process. I spent months working with a discreet craftsman who specialized in insurance replicas. These aren't the people who make costume jewelry for theater productions. They create pieces that fool insurance adjusters, law enforcement investigators, and sometimes even competing jewelers. Their work has to withstand professional scrutiny, at least initially. My explanation to him was simple and believable. I needed pieces that could fool someone handling them briefly, someone who wasn't a professional appraiser but had enough familiarity with expensive jewelry to spot obvious fakes. The craftsman understood immediately. He'd worked on similar projects for insurance companies creating decoy collections and for collectors who wanted to display replicas while keeping originals in more secure locations. The key insight was understanding that he wouldn't be examining them as a jeweler would. He'd be rushing to liquidate them, focused on quick profit rather than careful inspection. His greed would work in my favor, making him careless about details that might reveal the deception to someone taking their time. Each piece had to pass what I called the Grace Edie grab test. They needed to look and feel authentic during a hasty collection and packaging process. The weight distribution had to match the originals when someone lifted them quickly from their display positions. The surface textures had to feel right when fingers brushed against them during rapid handling. The physical replication required careful attention to weight and balance. We used gold-plated brass with strategic weighting to match the density of solid gold construction. Synthetic diamonds and sapphires were positioned in settings that would minimize extended examination, knowing that someone focused on rapid liquidation wouldn't spend time studying individual gems under magnification. The most expensive part wasn't the replicas themselves, but ensuring they had convincing documentation, fake certificates of authenticity, altered appraisal documents, even staged photographs for insurance records. Each piece needed a complete paper trail that would make the collection appear legitimate to any buyer who didn't dig too deep into the provenance. This fabricated documentation was critical to the legal trap. Creating fake certificates and altered appraisals would establish a clear pattern of fraud when he attempted to liquidate the pieces. Every forged document would become evidence of his criminal intent, creating a traceable path that prosecutors could follow from theft to attempted sale. Creating believable appraisal documents required understanding how legitimate appraisers work, the language they use, the specific details they record, the formatting and layout of professional certificates. We studied dozens of real appraisals to understand the patterns and terminology that would make our fabricated documents appear authentic. The staged photographs were particularly important. Each replica needed to be photographed in the same lighting conditions and angles as the original pieces in my daughter's insurance documentation. Someone comparing the stolen items to insurance records needed to see visual consistency that wouldn't raise immediate suspicions. I created an entire paper trail that would make the collection appear legitimate to jewelry dealers, pawn shops, and private buyers who might not have access to sophisticated authentication equipment. The goal was creating enough superficial legitimacy to enable quick sales before anyone could conduct detailed analysis. We even artificially aged some of the documentation to match the apparent age of pieces that were supposed to be vintage or antique. Certificate paper was treated to look like it had been stored in jewelry boxes for years. Appraisal forms were printed on older paper stock and handled enough to create appropriate wear patterns. The craftsman helped me understand something important about deception. The most convincing lies are the ones that include accurate details mixed with fabricated information. Our replicas included real serial numbers from actual jewelry pieces, just not the specific pieces they were supposed to represent. The documentation referenced real gemological laboratories and legitimate appraiser credentials, just applied to fabricated items. Building confidence in the deception required testing it under realistic conditions. We had the replicas examined by several jewelry dealers who weren't told they were looking at replicas. Their reactions confirmed that the pieces would pass casual professional inspection, especially in scenarios where dealers were focused on quick assessment for immediate purchase. The timeline was crucial. Each piece took weeks to complete properly, and the entire collection required coordination between multiple specialists. Gemstone cutters, metal workers, documentation experts, and aging specialists all contributed to creating a comprehensive deception that would withstand the kind of examination it was designed to face. Within 4 months, I had a complete duplicate collection that could fool anyone who wasn't a professional appraiser conducting detailed analysis. The replicas matched the originals in appearance, weight, and feel. The documentation created a believable chain of custody and valuation. The entire package would support quick liquidation by someone focused on profit rather than authentication. The psychological aspect was as important as the physical replication. Successful deception depends on giving people what they expect to see. Someone who believes they're stealing valuable jewelry expects those pieces to look, feel, and document like valuable jewelry. Meeting those expectations eliminates suspicion and enables the criminal behavior that creates legal evidence. The best traps are the ones where the victim never realizes they're walking into a cage. By the time the replicas were complete, I had created a perfect criminal opportunity that would generate perfect criminal evidence. His greed would drive him to steal what he thought was valuable, and his theft would provide prosecutors with everything they needed for conviction. Now I had to find the right moment to make the switch. The actual swap had to happen while my daughter was in the hospital during one of her longer stays when the house would be empty for days. Medical complications had extended what should have been a routine procedure into a week-long ordeal, creating the perfect window of opportunity. He was maintaining his devoted husband routine, splitting time between the hospital and work, following a predictable schedule that gave me exactly what I needed. I had a 4-hour window between when he left for work and when the housekeeper arrived. 4 hours to execute what felt like a heist movie in reverse, except instead of stealing something valuable, I was replacing valuable items with worthless replicas. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was essentially burglarizing my own daughter's house to protect her assets from the man she'd married. The timing had to be perfect. He left the house at 7:30 every morning, drove to the office, then visited the hospital during lunch before returning to work until 6. The housekeeper arrived at 11:30, giving me a narrow but workable time frame. I'd practiced the entire operation twice using my own jewelry collection, timing each step to ensure I could complete everything within the available window. Every piece had to be placed in exactly the same position, the same orientation, matching the original arrangement perfectly. The slightest deviation would signal that someone had been in the safe. He'd been studying that collection for months, photographing it obsessively. He'd notice if a ring was rotated differently or if a necklace was coiled in a slightly different pattern. I'd spent weeks photographing and measuring the exact placement of each item, creating a detailed map of how everything should look when I finished. Digital photos from multiple angles, measurements between pieces, notes about which items touched each other and how they were layered in the various compartments. The documentation was more thorough than most crime scene investigations. The safe combination was easy. My daughter had shared it months earlier when she asked me to retrieve important documents during a previous hospital stay. She trusted me with access to her most valuable possessions, never suspecting that trust would become the key to protecting those same possessions from her husband's greed. Each piece came out in sequence, was photographed in my hand for legal documentation, then immediately replaced with its replica counterpart. I wore thin cotton gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints, though that precaution was probably unnecessary since I had legitimate access to the house. The photography was crucial for establishing a complete record of what had been in the safe before the inevitable theft. The documentation process required photographing each original piece from multiple angles, showing identifying marks, serial numbers, and any unique characteristics that distinguished them from their replicas. These images would become critical evidence later, proving that the real collection had been present and subsequently removed by someone with legitimate access rather than stolen by an outside party. The real collection went into a safety deposit box at a different bank, one he'd never heard of, under a trust he didn't know existed. The bank was across town, far from any financial institutions he'd used for personal or business accounts. The trust structure added another layer of legal protection, ensuring that even if he somehow discovered the location, he couldn't access the contents without proper documentation and legal authorization. This layered approach meant he would face multiple barriers, even if he suspected the switch. Transferring items to the safety deposit box required multiple trips over several days, moving small portions of the collection each time to avoid carrying obviously valuable items in large quantities. Each piece was individually wrapped and cataloged before placement in the box, creating a complete inventory that matched the photographic documentation taken during the swap. The hardest part was maintaining the natural arrangement that had existed originally. Real jewelry collections aren't perfectly organized. People wear pieces, return them casually, stack items in ways that reflect normal use patterns. The replicas had to capture that lived-in quality rather than looking like a museum display. The work required intense concentration and steady hands. One dropped piece, one misplace. Item, one replica that didn't fit properly in its designated space would compromise the entire operation. I took frequent breaks to check my documentation, comparing the current arrangement to the photographs and measurements I'd prepared in advance. The psychological pressure was unlike anything I'd experienced in decades of high-stakes business negotiations. This wasn't about money or contracts. This was about protecting my daughter's legacy and ensuring that the man who'd married her for financial gain would face appropriate consequences for his planned theft. Completing the swap took 3 hours and 47 minutes, 13 minutes to spare before the housekeeper arrived. I spent those final minutes conducting a final comparison between the current arrangement and my reference photographs, confirming that every piece was positioned correctly and that no obvious evidence remained of the substitution. When I locked the safe that final time, I was sealing his fate, not protecting the jewelry. The real collection was secure in a location he couldn't access or even discover. The replica collection was positioned perfectly to enable the theft he'd been planning for months, while simultaneously creating the evidence needed to convict him. The combination lock clicked into place with a soft mechanical sound that felt like closing a trap. Everything was now in position for the final phase of the operation. He would steal what he believed were valuable family heirlooms, unknowingly collecting worthless replicas while generating perfect evidence of his criminal intent and actions. Sometimes the most important evidence is the evidence someone thinks they're stealing. By the time I left the house that morning, every element was aligned for his destruction. His greed would drive him to commit the exact crimes needed to put him away permanently, using evidence he'd unknowingly helped create through his own criminal behavior. But having the perfect trap means nothing if your target does. And walk into it willingly. The counterintuitive move was making the jewelry accessible. I actually made it easier for him to find and steal the collection, which goes against every instinct you'd expect from someone trying to protect valuable assets. Most people would have hidden the jewelry better, installed additional security systems, or moved everything to a bank vault where he couldn't reach it. But I needed him to take it quickly and confidently. Hesitation would be my enemy. If he became suspicious or started second-guessing the opportunity, he might examine the pieces more carefully. Extended examination would reveal that the replicas weren't authentic, potentially discovering the entire deception before he committed the crimes that would provide evidence for his prosecution. The psychology was straightforward. People who steal believe they're outsmarting you, so they don't question their good fortune when things seem easy. They interpret lack of security as incompetence rather than strategy. When valuable items appear poorly protected, thieves assume the owner is naive or careless, not calculating and prepared. I left the safe combination in a location where he'd eventually find it, not obviously visible, which would have raised suspicions, but hidden in a place where any determined thief would look. Inside my daughter's jewelry box, taped to the interior lid where someone searching through her personal belongings would discover it during a thorough examination. The placement had to feel natural, like something my daughter might have done for her own convenience. A small piece of paper with numbers written in her handwriting, folded and secured where she could access it easily, but where it wouldn't be immediately obvious to casual observers. Someone looking for exactly that kind of information would find it after a reasonable search. I even staged a conversation with my attorney where I mentioned, loud enough for him to overhear, that the jewelry wasn't properly insured and wouldn't be inventoried for months. The timing was perfect. He was in the kitchen getting coffee while I took the call in the adjacent living room, speaking just loudly enough that my voice would carry through the open doorway. The conversation sounded completely natural because most of it was genuine business discussion, real estate transfers, probate timelines, standard estate settlement procedures. I simply added strategic comments about the jewelry insurance lapse and mentioned that formal asset inventories wouldn't begin until legal proceedings were further along. His reaction was subtle but telling. The slight pause in his coffee preparation, the way he lingered near the doorway instead of returning immediately to the other room. The casual questions he asked later about typical estate settlement timelines and asset documentation requirements. He was processing the information and calculating his opportunity. The goal was creating urgency and opportunity simultaneously, making him believe he had a narrow window to act before family lawyers got involved and began formal asset protection procedures. Estate settlements involve extensive documentation, professional appraisals, and legal oversight that would make theft significantly more difficult once the process began. Criminal psychology research shows that urgency overrides caution in people predisposed to theft. When they believe an opportunity is temporary, they're more likely to act impulsively rather than conduct careful analysis that might reveal problems with their plan. Time pressure encourages mistakes, and mistakes create evidence. I presented myself as more helpless than I actually was, projecting an image of incompetence to encourage him to act impulsively. Comments about being overwhelmed by estate management responsibilities. Mentions of my unfamiliarity with jewelry values and insurance procedures. References to my reliance on others to handle complicated financial matters during this difficult time. The manufactured vulnerability was designed to increase his confidence while reducing his perceived risk. Thieves target people they believe won't fight back effectively. Legal experts understand that the best evidence of theft occurs when someone believes they're stealing something valuable and acts decisively on that belief. Intent matters enormously in criminal prosecution. Someone who accidentally takes something worthless can't be convicted of theft. Someone who deliberately steals what they believe are valuable assets has committed a serious crime regardless of the actual value. The replica jewelry would be worthless, but his belief in their value and his actions to acquire, transport, and liquidate them would constitute evidence of premeditated theft and criminal intent. Intent matters enormously in criminal prosecution. Every step he took to acquire, transport, and liquidate what he thought were my daughter's heirloom pieces would constitute evidence of premeditated theft and criminal intent. By making the theft easy, I was ensuring he'd commit the crime with confidence and leave a clear trail of evidence. Confident criminals are careless criminals. They don't cover their tracks as carefully because they don't expect to be caught. They document their success, communicate with accomplices, and engage with buyers in ways that create permanent records. The easier the theft appeared, the less time he'd spend planning security measures or developing contingency plans if something went wrong. Simple crimes often leave the most obvious evidence because the perpetrators don't expect sophisticated investigation or legal consequences. I was betting that his greed would overcome any lingering caution once he realized how accessible the collection was. The combination of valuable assets, weak security, and limited oversight would trigger his predatory instincts and drive him to act before the imaginary window of opportunity closed. The trap was psychological as much as physical. I needed him to feel clever, successful, and undetected while simultaneously creating all the evidence necessary for his conviction. His confidence in outsmarting a grieving old man would become the foundation for his legal destruction. Making the jewelry accessible wasn't just about enabling theft. It was about ensuring that when theft occurred, it would be systematic, documented, and impossible to explain as anything other than deliberate criminal behavior. Every aspect of the setup was designed to encourage actions that would satisfy the legal requirements for serious felony charges. The most effective traps don't catch prey through force. They convince prey to catch themselves by making the wrong choice seem like the obviously smart choice. His greed would guide him directly into a cage he'd never see closing until it was too late. Now all I had to do was wait and see how quickly that greed would drive him to action. His timeline revealed everything about his character and his intentions. I expected him to wait at least a few weeks after the funeral, maybe even a month or two to maintain some appearance of proper grieving. But greed operates on its own schedule, and his schedule was apparently very aggressive. The funeral was on a Tuesday. My daughter was laid to rest with all the dignity and respect she deserved, surrounded by family and friends who genuinely mourned her loss. We gathered afterward at the house, sharing memories and supporting each other through those first impossible hours of grief. He played his role perfectly that day, the devastated widower accepting condolences with appropriate solemnity. By Friday morning, I was getting calls from jewelry dealers asking about authentication of pieces he was trying to sell. 3 days. He'd given my daughter's memory exactly 3 days before beginning the liquidation of what he believed were her most precious possessions. The speed was breathtaking in its audacity and perfect for my purposes. His impatience was both shocking and ideal. The faster he moved, the more obvious his guilt became to anyone watching. The first call came from a dealer in the jewelry district downtown. Professional, cautious, asking if I could verify the provenance of several pieces that someone was attempting to sell. The dealer had the documentation I'd fabricated, complete with the phone number that was supposed to connect him to the insurance company for verification. That phone number forwarded directly to my attorney's office. The dealer explained that a man had brought in what appeared to be valuable vintage pieces, claiming they were inherited items he needed to liquidate quickly for estate expenses. The story sounded plausible on its surface, except for the timing. Estate settlements don't typically require immediate jewelry liquidation, and most people wait longer than 72 hours after a funeral before converting heirlooms to cash. He didn't wait for the will to be read. He didn't consult with other family members about the disposition of valuable assets. He didn't pretend to grieve for a decent interval or maintain any appearance of respect for my daughter's memory. His behavior demonstrated exactly the kind of predatory urgency that would be impossible to explain away in court. Within 72 hours, he'd approached 4 different dealers across the city. Using identical stories with multiple dealers in the same geographic area was amateur-level criminal behavior. His haste made him sloppy. Professional thieves know to vary their approaches, use different explanations, and spread their activities across wider areas to avoid creating obvious patterns. But he wasn't a professional thief. He was a greedy opportunist who thought he was cleverer than everyone around him. His overconfidence led him to make mistakes that experienced criminals would never make. The same arrogance that had driven him to marry my daughter for her assets was now creating perfect evidence for his prosecution. One dealer was suspicious enough to photograph him during their interaction. Security cameras captured him examining pieces with the focused intensity of someone calculating profit margins rather than someone mourning the loss of family heirlooms. The video footage showed him handling the jewelry with clinical detachment, turning pieces to check for hallmarks and asking pointed questions about resale values. Another dealer recorded their conversation when the man became agitated about authentication delays. His voice on that recording revealed someone frustrated by obstacles to quick liquidation, not someone emotionally attached to meaningful family pieces. The language he used was transactional, focused on immediate financial return rather than preserving family legacy. His approach to the dealers revealed his complete misunderstanding of how legitimate inheritance sales work. Real heirs typically research proper valuation procedures, consult with estate attorneys about tax implications, and take time to understand what they're selling. They ask about the history and craftsmanship of pieces, not just their immediate cash value. The dealer's suspicions were aroused not just by his timing, but by his obvious unfamiliarity with the pieces themselves. Someone inheriting family jewelry usually knows something about the item's significance, their origins, or their sentimental value. He demonstrated no emotional connection to any of the pieces, treating them purely as commodities to be converted to cash. The authentication phone calls were creating a perfect evidence chain. My attorney was documenting every inquiry, recording the dealer's concerns and building a timeline that demonstrated systematic attempted fraud. Each call added another data point showing premeditated theft and deliberate deception. The speed of his actions eliminated any possible defense based on grief or emotional instability. 3 days after the funeral was not enough time for someone to make rational decisions about valuable inherited assets. It was barely enough time to locate and inventory such items, let alone research their value and arrange for legitimate sales. His timeline created what prosecutors call consciousness of guilt. Legitimate heirs don't rush to liquidate valuable inherited items immediately after funerals. People who steal those items do exactly what he was doing: convert them to untraceable cash as quickly as possible before their theft is discovered. The dealer's documentation was meticulous because they were protecting themselves from potential legal liability. Each interaction was recorded, photographed, and documented in ways that would provide clear evidence of his attempted fraud. Their professional caution was creating the evidence chain that would convict him. His greed had turned him into the perfect defendant. Every decision he made was creating documentation that no jury would interpret as anything other than calculated theft. The timeline alone told a story of someone who had planned these thefts long before my daughter died and was executing that plan with ruthless efficiency. Patience is a virtue in most circumstances, but impatience in your enemies is a gift that keeps giving evidence. What he didn't realize was that every transaction he was making was being documented in ways that would eventually destroy him. Modern commerce leaves digital footprints everywhere, and he was about to discover just how permanent those footprints could be. Every transaction he made was creating evidence that would eventually convict him, and he had no idea he was building his own legal coffin. Modern jewelry sales aren't casual handshake deals anymore. They require documentation, identification, and often waiting periods designed to prevent exactly the kind of fraud he was attempting. Each step created a permanent record of his theft. He was so focused on converting the jewelry to cash that he ignored how traceable every step of the process would be. Every dealer interaction generated paperwork. Every authentication attempt left digital records. Every bank deposit created transaction histories that investigators could analyze months later. The documentation requirements alone should have warned him about the risks he was taking. Legitimate jewelry dealers maintain detailed records of every purchase, including photographs of items, copies of seller identification, and documentation of provenance claims. These aren't optional procedures. They're legal requirements designed to prevent dealers from unknowingly purchasing stolen goods. Bank deposits created the most damaging evidence trail. Large cash deposits trigger automatic reporting requirements that alert federal authorities to potential money laundering activities. He was depositing thousands of dollars in cash over a period of days, creating exactly the kind of pattern that draws investigation from financial crimes units. His choice of asset type revealed both his strategy and his ignorance. Cash, jewelry, and personal effects are generally exempt from tax liabilities for the recipient in inheritance transfers. This motivated him to liquidate this specific asset quickly, believing he could convert it to untraceable cash and bypass the formal, taxable processes required for registered investments or real estate. But his understanding of inheritance law was dangerously incomplete. The exemption applies to legitimate heirs, not thieves presenting fraudulent documentation. Even his transportation to different jewelry districts left digital fingerprints that investigators could follow later. Rideshare services maintain detailed records of pickup locations, destinations, and timing. His phone's location services were creating a minute-by-minute map of his movements between dealers, banks, and other locations relevant to his criminal activities. The fake documentation I'd created was designed to fall apart under professional scrutiny. When dealers attempted to verify authenticity through the phone numbers and references provided, they were connecting with my attorney's office rather than legitimate authentication services. Each verification attempt created evidence of fraud while simultaneously alerting my legal team to his activities. Professional appraisers and authentication services maintain databases of legitimate certificates, serial numbers, and provenance documentation. The fabricated papers he was presenting wouldn't survive comparison to these databases, meaning every authentication attempt was generating evidence that he was knowingly presenting fraudulent documentation to support fraudulent sales. He opened new bank accounts to handle the cash, apparently believing this would somehow insulate him from detection, but he used his real name and social security number, making every deposit a federal crime that created permanent records linking him directly to the stolen funds. Opening accounts specifically to handle proceeds from criminal activity is money laundering, which carries much more serious penalties than simple theft. His phone became the most damaging evidence source of all. Text messages to friends bragging about his inheritance windfall, photos of cash stacks, even casual mentions of his good fortune in social media posts. He was documenting his own criminal success in ways that would be impossible to explain away during prosecution. The messages revealed his mindset and planning process. References to liquidating assets, comments about finally having access to valuable items, jokes about his late wife's expensive taste in jewelry. Each message was evidence of premeditation and criminal intent that prosecutors could use to demonstrate this wasn't impulsive behavior driven by grief. Digital communications don't disappear when people think they do. Phone companies maintain message records, cloud services back up photos automatically, and social media platforms preserve posts even after users delete them. His electronic bragging was creating a permanent record of his criminal activities. His spending patterns after the jewelry sales created additional evidence of criminal proceeds. Large purchases made with cash immediately after liquidating what he claimed were inherited items. The timing and amounts were too convenient to be coincidental. Investigators could trace his enhanced lifestyle directly to the stolen jewelry sales. The dealers he approached were creating their own evidence chains by following proper procedures for potentially suspicious transactions. Security camera footage showing his demeanor and behavior during sales attempts, audio recordings of conversations where he made false claims about inheritance and ownership, written records of his responses to routine questions about provenance and family history. Each dealer interaction was generating multiple forms of evidence simultaneously, visual records showing his physical presence at specific locations and times, audio records capturing his false statements about the jewelry's origins, documentary evidence showing his presentation of fraudulent authentication papers and his reactions when dealers raised questions about authenticity. By the time I contacted authorities, They had a complete financial timeline showing systematic theft and money laundering. The evidence chain was so comprehensive, too. Hat prosecutors could demonstrate not just that crimes had occurred, but exactly when they'd been planned, how they'd been executed, and what had been done with the proceeds. The investigation required minimal additional work because he'd documented everything himself. Bank records showed the money flow. Phone records revealed his communications and planning. Dealer records demonstrated his fraudulent claims and false documentation. Digital evidence captured his celebration of criminal success. His overconfidence had led him to create the perfect criminal case file. Every decision he made after the theft was designed to convert stolen goods to usable cash, but each decision also created evidence that would eventually convict him. He was simultaneously the perpetrator and the primary witness against himself. The most dangerous witness against any criminal is usually the criminal himself. Their own actions, communications, and behavior patterns provide prosecutors with everything needed for conviction. Smart criminals understand this and take extensive precautions to avoid creating evidence trails. Greedy criminals focus only on profit and ignore the permanent records they're creating. His systematic documentation of criminal success would become the foundation of his systematic legal destruction. But creating evidence and having that evidence discovered are two different things. The moment when those two realities collide is usually when criminals realize they've been outplayed. That moment was coming faster than he expected. The phone call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after he'd sold what he thought was the last piece of my daughter's collection. The ringtone cut through the silence of my bedroom like an alarm. Nobody calls at that hour with good news. I answered on the second ring, already knowing this conversation would be worth remembering. His voice was different. The confident smugness that had characterized every interaction since my daughter's death was gone, replaced by something that sounded like panic barely held in check. He'd been contacted by federal investigators who wanted to discuss irregularities in recent jewelry transactions tied to his name. The word irregularities carried weight that even someone as arrogant as him couldn't ignore. He demanded to know if I'd done something to the jewelry, if I'd somehow switched the pieces. His words tumbled over each other in a rush of accusations and desperate questions. Had I been in the house without permission? Had I accessed the safe? Did I know anything about problems with authentication documents or dealer complaints about fraudulent certificates? The beautiful irony of his panic was immediately obvious. He was demanding answers about theft while simultaneously confessing to attempted sale of items that didn't belong to him. Each question revealed another layer of his criminal behavior. You can't ask about switched jewelry without admitting you took the original pieces. You can't complain about authentication problems without confirming you tried to sell inherited items without proper authorization. I let him talk, listening to him dig his own grave with increasing desperation. His questions became more specific and more incriminating. He wanted to know about the documentation, the certificates, the appraisal records that dealers had questioned. He was essentially providing me with a complete confession of his fraudulent activities, delivered in real time over a recorded phone line. The moment he realized his mistake was audible. That sharp intake of breath when he understood that admitting he'd sold the jewelry was also admitting he'd stolen it from my daughter's estate. The silence that followed was different from ordinary pauses in conversation. It was the silence of someone recognizing they'd just confessed to federal crimes. He tried to recover by claiming he had permission to liquidate assets. Estate management responsibilities, he called it. Financial obligations that required immediate attention, bills that needed paying, debts that demanded settlement. But my simple question was, if he had legitimate authority, why hadn't he consulted with other family members? And why approach dealers with stories about inherited pieces rather than proper estate documentation? His answers revealed the depth of his deception. He claimed he'd wanted to handle everything quietly to spare the family additional stress during a difficult time. He suggested that immediate liquidation was necessary to prevent insurance complications and storage problems. He even tried to frame the secret sales as protective measures designed to preserve family privacy. None of his explanations addressed the fundamental question of authorization. Spouses don't automatically inherit authority to liquidate valuable assets without estate court approval or family consultation. His secret approach to the sales demonstrated consciousness of guilt, not protective discretion. His desperation became increasingly audible as the conversation continued. He offered to split the money he'd made from the sales, apparently not understanding that the money was evidence of federal crimes rather than profit from legitimate transactions. He was trying to negotiate a deal for stolen property with the victim's father, revealing a complete misunderstanding of his legal situation. The offer to share proceeds was particularly damaging because it acknowledged that he'd converted family assets to personal profit without authorization. You can't split money from legitimate estate liquidation because that money belongs to the estate, not to individual family members. His willingness to negotiate profit sharing confirmed that he understood he'd stolen the jewelry for personal gain. I remained calm throughout his increasingly frantic explanations. My responses were measured, focused on understanding exactly what he'd done, rather than expressing outrage or making accusations. I wanted him to provide as much detail as possible about his criminal activities, while he was still panicked enough to be careless about self-incrimination. The conversation took an interesting turn when he realized that his authentication problems meant the jewelry wasn't what he'd believed it to be. He started asking direct questions about whether I'd replaced original pieces with replicas, whether the documentation had been deliberately falsified, whether the entire collection had been somehow compromised. These questions revealed his growing understanding that he'd been manipulated, but they also confirmed his criminal intent. Someone with legitimate authority to sell inherited jewelry wouldn't be concerned about replicas or falsified documentation. Those concerns only matter to someone who knows they're engaging in theft and fraud. His final gambit was threatening to expose what I'd done, apparently not grasping that exposing the replica swap meant confessing to the original theft. He was going to tell investigators that I'd tricked him into stealing worthless replicas instead of valuable originals. The logical absurdity of that threat seemed lost on him in his desperation. The threat was empty because it required admitting criminal behavior to make the accusation meaningful. He wouldn't claim fraud without explaining why he'd been attempting to sell my daughter's jewelry without family knowledge or estate authorization. His threat was actually an offer to provide prosecutors with additional evidence of premeditation and criminal intent. The conversation ended with him hanging up abruptly when he realized that every word he'd spoken was creating additional evidence against him. His panic had driven him to call seeking answers, but the call had provided investigators with a comprehensive confession delivered in his own words. That call was recorded legally since he'd initiated the contact and I was in a jurisdiction where one-party consent applied to phone recordings. The audio became a key piece of evidence showing his knowledge of guilt and his understanding that federal crimes had been committed. His own words provided prosecutors with proof of criminal intent that would have been difficult to establish through circumstantial evidence alone. The moment a thief realizes they've been outplayed is usually the moment they confess to everything. His panic-driven phone call had accomplished what hours of interrogation might not have achieved. He'd provided a complete audio record of his criminal activities, his fraudulent explanations, and his consciousness of guilt. His desperation had transformed him from a confident predator into a terrified defendant, and he'd documented that transformation himself. The federal agents who'd been building their case now had everything they needed. The only question remaining was timing. The arrest happened at his workplace, in front of colleagues who'd heard him bragging about his sudden financial windfall for weeks. Federal agents don't make public spectacles unless they want to send a message. And they wanted everyone in that office to understand exactly what happens to people who steal from grieving families. The timing was deliberate. Mid-morning on a Thursday, when the office would be at full capacity and maximum visibility for his professional humiliation. Federal agents don't make arrests unless they're certain of conviction. They'd spent months building an airtight case using evidence he'd provided himself through his own greedy actions. His colleagues watched as agents presented their credentials and read charges that included far more than simple theft. Wire fraud for the electronic communications he'd used to coordinate sales. Money laundering for the systematic conversion of stolen assets to cash through multiple accounts. Conspiracy to defraud an estate for his coordinated efforts to liquidate assets without proper authorization. The charges weren't just theft. They were federal crimes that carried decades of prison time and permanent destruction of his professional reputation. His bragging about sudden wealth had created witnesses who could testify about his suspicious financial gains immediately following his wife's death. His attorney quickly realized the case was unwinnable because every piece of evidence came from his own actions, his own choices. Defense attorneys prefer cases where they can argue about interpretation of evidence or challenge prosecution theories. This case offered no ambiguity. The prosecution had bank records, dealer testimonies, recorded phone calls, and his own digital footprint, an evidence chain built entirely from his documented criminal behavior. The replica jewelry became exhibits in court, demonstrating both the premeditation required for the theft operation he thought he was running and the sophisticated deception that had trapped him into providing perfect evidence of criminal intent. Each replica piece was tagged and cataloged as evidence of his systematic theft planning. The courtroom display was particularly effective because it showed jurors exactly what he'd believed he was stealing: valuable family heirlooms that represented decades of family history and emotional significance. His willingness to liquidate these pieces immediately after his wife's death demonstrated the callous calculation behind his criminal behavior. His defense team attempted several strategies that revealed their desperation. They tried to argue entrapment, claiming he'd been manipulated into committing crimes he wouldn't have committed otherwise. But you can't entrap someone into stealing. You can only provide them with the opportunity to reveal their true character through their choices. The entrapment defense failed because entrapment requires government agents to induce criminal behavior in someone not predisposed to commit crimes. The evidence showed he'd been planning theft for months before any opportunity was provided. His behavior patterns, his systematic assessment of valuable assets, and his strategic positioning for post-death liquidation demonstrated clear predisposition to commit exactly the crimes he'd been charged with. They tried arguing emotional distress from grief as a mitigating factor for his criminal behavior, but the timeline of his actions contradicted any claim of impaired judgment. His systematic approach to dealer contacts, his careful documentation of sales proceeds, and his strategic bank account management demonstrated calculated criminal planning rather than grief-driven impulsive behavior. The prosecution countered by presenting evidence of his behavior before his wife's death. The photography sessions where he'd cataloged jewelry pieces, the questions about insurance coverage and estate planning that demonstrated premeditation, the systematic assessment of family assets that showed he'd been planning liquidation long before opportunity arose. The most damaging testimony came from the jewelry dealers who described his suspicious behavior and obvious lies about the piece's origins. Professional dealers understand the difference between legitimate inheritance sales and fraudulent liquidation attempts. His behavior had triggered their professional suspicions immediately. Dealers testified about his impatience with authentication procedures, his focus on quick cash conversion rather than proper valuation, and his obvious unfamiliarity with pieces he claimed to have inherited from family. His demeanor during sales attempts had been transactional rather than emotional, focused on profit margins rather than preserving family legacy. The recorded conversations with dealers provided audio evidence of his false claims about inheritance authorization and estate management responsibilities. His voice on those recordings revealed someone frustrated by obstacles to quick liquidation, not someone emotionally attached to meaningful family pieces. Security camera footage from multiple dealers showed his body language and behavior during attempted sales. He'd handled the jewelry with clinical detachment, examining pieces for value indicators rather than sentimental significance. His behavior was consistent with someone liquidating stolen goods rather than inherited heirlooms. The prosecution presented financial analysis showing his spending patterns after the jewelry sales, luxury purchases made with cash immediately following liquidation attempts, restaurant charges, entertainment expenses, and retail transactions that far exceeded his previous spending capacity. The contrast between his financial behavior before and after the theft was stark enough to demonstrate criminal proceeds. His phone records provided additional evidence of criminal planning and execution. Calls to dealers, searches for jewelry authentication services, and communications about asset liquidation that demonstrated systematic criminal behavior rather than impulsive grief responses. The plea bargain negotiations revealed the strength of the prosecution's case. His attorneys understood that trial would result in maximum sentences on all charges. The evidence was comprehensive, the timeline was clear, and the criminal intent was undeniable. Fighting the charges would only increase his eventual punishment. The final plea agreement included full restitution for the attempted theft, though the replica jewelry meant actual financial losses were minimal. 5 years in federal prison for the wire fraud and money laundering charges. Forfeiture of all assets purchased with proceeds from the fraudulent sales, including luxury items and entertainment expenses that exceeded his legitimate income. The forfeiture provisions were particularly comprehensive because they included assets purchased with commingled funds that included stolen money. His attempts to blend legitimate income with criminal proceeds had contaminated his entire financial situation, making all recent purchases subject to government seizure. His professional licenses were revoked as part of the conviction. His career in financial services was permanently destroyed. His social connections were severed by the public nature of his criminal behavior. The systematic theft of family assets had cost him everything he'd tried to gain through criminal activity. Justice isn't always swift, but it's remarkably thorough when criminals document their own crimes through their greed and overconfidence. The legal machinery had processed his case with mechanical precision, converting his documented criminal behavior into appropriate consequences. But the real victory wasn't his conviction. It was what remained protected in that safety deposit box across town. The collection I retrieved from that safety deposit box months later wasn't just precious metals and stones. It was evidence of something more valuable than market prices or insurance appraisals could measure. Each piece represented the difference between someone who understood legacy and someone who saw only liquidation opportunities. To him, they were simply commodities with market values that could be converted to cash for personal use. He failed to understand that the physical objects were only conduits for family history, connecting generations through a principle more valuable than simple monetary worth. His systematic approach to liquidating these pieces revealed exactly what kind of person he'd always been beneath the surface charm and manufactured concern. The grandmother's engagement ring, the pearl necklace from graduation, the sapphire earrings marking academic achievement. Each piece told stories about celebrations and milestones that had shaped our family's identity over generations. His willingness to convert these memories into immediate profit demonstrated a fundamental inability to understand what made them valuable beyond their material composition. Family heirlooms serve as tangible links to ancestors whose choices and values shaped current family members through accumulated wisdom and experience. These pieces carry stories that define family character and provide context for understanding where we came from and who we're meant to become. They represent inheritance in the truest sense, passing down more than wealth. The replicas he'd sold were worthless precisely because they lacked this essential quality. Perfect reproductions of the physical characteristics, but empty of the emotional weight and historical significance that made the originals irreplaceable. They were beautiful objects without souls, valuable items without value. Metal and stones can be replicated with remarkable accuracy using modern techniques and materials, but the experiences attached to original pieces cannot be manufactured or transferred to copies. The joy of receiving them as gifts, the pride of wearing them at special occasions, the comfort of touching them during difficult times, these memories belong exclusively to authentic items. His focus on immediate liquidation demonstrated complete disconnection from the emotional significance of inherited items. Someone who understood their true worth would have taken time to learn about their histories, their previous owners, and their roles in family traditions. He approached them purely as financial assets to be converted to cash. The trust structure I established ensures the collection will pass to family members who understand its significance beyond monetary value. Living trusts provide legal frameworks for preserving assets while maintaining family control over their eventual disposition. They enable transfer of both financial and emotional inheritance to appropriate recipients. These legal structures protect family legacy from individuals who might prioritize immediate financial gain over long-term preservation of family history. They establish clear guidelines for asset management and create barriers against opportunistic liquidation by people who lack emotional connection to inherited items. The trust provisions specify that recipients must demonstrate understanding of the collection's family significance before gaining access to individual pieces. This requirement ensures that future inheritors will value the items appropriately rather than viewing them solely as convertible assets. Professional estate planning creates multiple layers of protection for valuable family items. Physical security through proper storage and insurance coverage. Legal security through trusts and inheritance structures that prevent unauthorized access. Emotional security through education about family history and item significance that connects recipients to their heritage. The collection's protection also required understanding the psychology of financial predators who target family assets during vulnerable periods. These individuals exploit grief and confusion to gain access to valuable items they can convert to personal profit. They rely on family members being too distracted by emotional trauma to notice systematic theft. Defensive planning means anticipating predatory behavior and creating obstacles that make theft difficult to execute and impossible to hide. Documentation systems that track item locations and ownership histories, legal structures that prevent unauthorized liquidation through multiple approval requirements, professional oversight that monitors asset management during estate transitions. The preserved collection now serves as more than just valuable jewelry. It represents successful defense of family legacy against someone who sought to exploit tragedy for personal gain. Each protected piece validates the importance of strategic thinking during emotional crises, when clear judgment becomes most critical. The experience taught me that protecting what matters most sometimes requires allowing dangerous people to reveal their true intentions through their actions. By creating opportunities for criminal behavior, you enable predators to document their own guilt while simultaneously preserving what they're attempting to steal. Family legacy protection demands both emotional intelligence and strategic planning, understanding what items mean to family identity and developing systematic approaches to preserve them from people who see only opportunities for personal enrichment. The physical objects matter, but the stories they carry matter more. The jewelry represents continuity between past and future generations, physical objects that carry family stories forward through time, maintaining connections that define who we are and where we came from. Sometimes, protecting what matters most means letting people reveal who they really are. But protecting family legacy extends far beyond individual collections or specific valuable items. The real lesson wasn't about jewelry or even about one predatory son-in-law. It was about understanding how family predators operate and developing systematic approaches to neutralize their threats before they can cause permanent damage. The methods that saved my daughter's collection can protect any family's legacy from people who view inheritance as opportunity rather than responsibility. The key is recognizing predatory behavior early and responding with strategic planning rather than emotional reactions. Several protective mechanisms can shield your assets from family predators who view your death as a business opportunity rather than an emotional loss. Financial predators within families operate on predictable patterns. They rely on grief, confusion, and the widespread assumption that older people are easy targets who won't fight back effectively. They exploit emotional vulnerability during crisis periods when family members are least capable of making strategic decisions about asset protection. These individuals position themselves as helpful during difficult times, offering to handle complicated financial matters that grieving family members might find overwhelming. Their assistance always comes with increased access to valuable assets and reduced oversight from other family members who might question their motives or methods. The challenge is protecting your legacy without destroying family relationships or living in constant suspicion of everyone around you. Effective asset protection requires strategic thinking that doesn't poison normal family interactions or create unnecessary conflict with people who have legitimate concern for your welfare. Start with comprehend. Conceive documentation of everything valuable you own. Photographs from multiple angles showing identifying characteristics, serial numbers, and condition details. Professional appraisals that establish current market values and provide authentication of materials and craftsmanship. detailed inventories that include provenance information and family history for each significant item. This documentation serves multiple purposes simultaneously. It establishes legal ownership in ways that survive challenges from people claiming inherited rights or disputed ownership. It provides insurance companies with evidence needed for coverage claims if items are stolen or damaged. It creates accountability systems that make unauthorized disposal difficult to execute without detection. Digital photography should capture details that distinguish original items from potential replicas or substitutes. Close-ups of manufacturer marks, unique wear patterns, and interior mechanisms that would be expensive or difficult to replicate accurately. These images become evidence if you need to prove that items have been switched or stolen. The documentation also protects against fraud schemes where predators claim valuable items were damaged or lost, then attempt to collect insurance proceeds while keeping the originals. Create multiple layers of protection using different security approaches that complement each other. Safety deposit boxes for items you don't need regular access to. Home safes for pieces you want available but protected. Trust structures that prevent any single person from accessing everything simultaneously without proper legal authorization. The key principle is redundancy in your protective systems. If someone defeats one layer of security, additional barriers prevent them from accessing your entire collection. Multiple storage locations mean that even sophisticated thieves can't eliminate all your valuable assets through a single operation. Professional trust structures provide legal frameworks that survive your death and continue protecting assets from predatory behavior by surviving family members. In structured estate planning, mechanisms like alter ego or joint partner trusts, often used for those 65 and older, allow assets to bypass probate and transfer directly to beneficiaries, adding layers of legal protection that prevent unauthorized liquidation and reduce the tax impact on the estate. These aren't just financial instruments. They're strategic tools that define how your legacy will be preserved and transferred according to your intentions, rather than other people's opportunistic plans. Consider professional asset protection services that specialize in family wealth preservation and inheritance planning. These specialists understand predatory behavior patterns and can design protective systems that account for threats you might not anticipate. Their experience includes dealing with exactly the kinds of situations that destroy unprepared families. Estate planning attorneys who focus on asset protection bring knowledge about legal structures that provide maximum security while maintaining family access to inherited wealth. They understand how financial predators operate and can create barriers that prevent exploitation without creating unnecessary complications for legitimate heirs. Test your security systems by observing how potential threats behave around your valuables. Their reactions will tell you everything you need to know about their true intentions and their level of interest in your assets. People with predatory intentions reveal themselves through the questions they ask and the attention they pay to valuable items. Watch for individuals who show unusual interest in your possessions' values rather than their sentimental significance. Someone asking about insurance coverage, garage locations, or market prices is gathering intelligence for potential exploitation. Their behavior patterns reveal their priorities and help you identify threats before they become active problems. The goal isn't to catch thieves after they've stolen your valuables. It's to make theft so risky and traceable that even greedy people choose different targets. Effective deterrence prevents crimes rather than punishing them after the damage is done. Professional criminals avoid targets that require excessive effort or create significant evidence trails. They prefer opportunities that offer high rewards with minimal risks of detection or prosecution. Your protective systems should create exactly the opposite conditions, making any theft attempt obviously criminal and easily traceable. Make unauthorized access to your assets require multiple steps that each create permanent records. Bank access logs, security system recordings, and documentation requirements that establish clear trails showing who accessed what items and when. These records become evidence that supports prosecution if theft occurs. Create accountability systems where multiple people have oversight responsibilities for different aspects of your asset protection plan. Your attorney monitors trust compliance. Your bank manages safety deposit access, your insurance agent tracks coverage adequacy, and your family members maintain awareness of protective measures without having individual control over everything. True wealth protection means ensuring your legacy survives, not just your death, but the people who might exploit it afterward. Your protective planning must account for threats that emerge during estate transitions when normal oversight mechanisms are disrupted by grief and legal complications. Consider how your protective systems will function when you're no longer available to monitor them directly. Successor trustees, backup authorization procedures, and professional oversight that continue. As operating without your personal involvement, these systems must be robust enough to protect your legacy from people who view your death as an opportunity for personal enrichment. Build flexibility into your protective structures so they can adapt to changing family circumstances without requiring complete reconstruction. People change, relationships evolve, and threats emerge from unexpected directions. Your protection systems need mechanisms for responding to new risks while maintaining security for core assets. The most sophisticated predators operate on long timelines, positioning themselves years in advance for opportunities that arise during family crises. Your protective planning must account for these extended campaigns by creating systems that remain effective even when threats develop gradually over extended periods. Document your protective measures in ways that help legitimate heirs understand and maintain them while keeping specific details away from potential threats. Your family needs enough information to work with your systems without compromising the security those systems provide. Effective legacy protection requires understanding that some family members may view your death as a business opportunity rather than an emotional loss. Your planning must account for this reality, without allowing cynicism to poison your relationships with people who genuinely care about your welfare. The systems that protected my daughter's collection can protect any family's legacy from people who view inheritance as opportunity rather than responsibility. The foundation of successful wealth preservation is recognizing that preparation and wisdom often matter more than the assets themselves. Strategic planning during family crises determines whether you protect your legacy or lose it to people who view your death as their opportunity. The difference between being a victim and being prepared is usually just a few months of careful planning and the wisdom to understand that not everyone who calls you family deserves your trust. Strategic thinking during emotional crises separates people who lose everything from those who protect what matters most. His greed created the perfect evidence chain for his own conviction. My preparation turned his predatory behavior into his legal destruction. If you believe that protecting your legacy requires both love and strategy, hit that like button and subscribe. Subscribe if you want to see how the final trap was sprung. Grief doesn't make you weak. It makes you focused on what really matters.